Hi, everybody, and welcome. We're so glad you could join us today. This is Diane Devine, Leadership Circle's Development Officer at the Museum of Natural History, and I'm sorry I'm not on the screen. We had a little glitch with my camera, but I'm still here to present this wonderful series. Our Legends of the Hall series focuses on some interesting past events and people of the museum and the impacts they had in shaping who we are today. So let me introduce our speakers for tonight. We're joined by Dr. Jonathan Hoffman, who's our Dibblee Curator of Earth Science. And Jonathan came to the Museum of Natural History back in 2017. He holds a PhD in geology from the University of Wyoming, a master's in geology from the University of Florida, and a Bachelor of Arts in geology from Occidental College. Over the years, his field research has taken him across the United States, including California, Florida, Kansas, Oregon, Utah, and Wyoming. Dr. Hoffman is responsible for the museum's geology and paleontology collections and exhibits. He has placed a strong emphasis on reanimating the fossil collecting program and growing the earth sciences collection to fully represent the Central Coast paleontology and geology. Channel Islands National Park is a key component to this goal, and the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History is the official repository for the park, and Jonathan has been working with the Park Service to protect and recover fossils from the islands, including the recovery of the first known Sirenian or sea cow fossil. Jonathan is joined tonight by geologist John Powell, who studied at Chico State University and San Jose State University, and John is registered geologist and engineering geologist with the state of California. John served as a member of the museum's Board of Trustees for 7 years and as the Dibblee Foundation Secretary and President for 30 years. A lifelong Ventura County resident, John and his wife Gail are members of the museum's leadership circles of giving while enjoying retired life with their 2 children and grandchildren. And John has even found time to serve as a geologist on a few of our leadership circle field trips. He was a personal friend to Tom and Loretta Dibblee, and we're so glad he is able to join us this evening. So now we present Legends of the Halls, geologist, cartographer, philanthropist, Tom Wilson Dibbley Jr. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Diane. Really appreciate everyone being here tonight to join us to talk about Tom Dibblee. He's really an iconic figure in geology, particularly here in California and certainly here in Santa Barbara, where he was born and raised. So we're really excited to be talking about Tom tonight and the legacy he's left behind and where we hope things will be headed. So Tom Wilson Dibbley Jr. was born on October 11th, 1911 in Santa Barbara. His parents were Tom Dibblee Sr. and Anita Orena Dibblee. They lived in Santa Barbara till Tom was about 4 years old and then moved up to San Francisco for a job for his father. They moved back down to Santa Barbara when he was 8. Tom had a tough time in school, particularly when he was younger. For those really cute little curls you see there, the other school kids actually gave him a pretty hard time about that. He also recalled when he'd gotten back up to Santa Barbara that he was pretty apprehensive when he'd go to school with the other children. And one of the major factors in this was that Tom had been hard of hearing his entire life. He had 2 younger sisters and a youngest brother. Their names are Virginia, Yvonne, and John. And after they'd moved back to Santa Barbara, Tom would spend the week in Santa Barbara going to school, and then weekends and summers at the Rancho San Julian. Tom is of some pretty famous ancestry for these parts. He was descendants, or his mother's lineage was descendant of Captain Jose Antonio de la Guerra y Noriega. And Captain de la Guerra was commandant of the Presidio here in Santa Barbara. And for his service, he had acquired 500,000 acres of land through different land grants and purchases. This included Rancho San Julian, as you can see here from this aerial or satellite shot. And it was originally a land grant family ranch established in 1837. And it started out at 48,000 acres, but would be roughly 24,000 acres when Tom was growing up there. The De la Guerra family have managed the land for the entirety of its existence for the last 184 years. Thomas Bloodgood Dibblee, a rancher who had partnered with the Hollisters, bought the ranch in 1867, and then a year later married Captain de la Guerra's granddaughter, Francesca. As a child, Tom spent a lot of time going back and forth between Santa Barbara and the ranch, and it would typically take well over 2 hours to make the drive. And if there had been any rain like today, he would have been stuck either in Santa Barbara or Rancho San Julian, since most of the roads were unpaved. Now, Tom's childhood gives us a little glimpse of some of the skills that he would later really capitalize on as a prolific geologic mapper. And what we're looking at here is his homemade catalog of his marble collection. This is known as the Tejon collection of marbles. And he started this collection when he was about 11 years old. Initially, these marbles were acquired through either buying them at stores or winning them off of other kids, although he would eventually start making his own marbles. And as you can see from this opening page, he had updated this catalog a few times. So he initially wrote it when he was about 16 years old, and then updated it again the next year, and then again when he was about 22. As you go through this catalog, you can see that Tom had a keen eye for classification. This is a chart at the very beginning of the catalog, and it outlines the classification scheme he used for the entire marble collection, identifying different features to break into the different groups. And it included chapters where he would go into detail about each category. These marble category descriptions were highly detailed and colorful, with comprehensive histories of each marble type and the attributes he'd observed. By the time Tom was 30, he'd started making his own marbles. And this really was a nice intersection between his passion for collecting marbles and his passion for geology. As you can see here, he made a number of marbles out of Franciscan chert, one of the prevalent rock types throughout the San Andreas Valley. He had also really accrued a nice eye for angles. These were all done without a tumbler. Which if for any lapidary hobbyists out there, you know this is quite the feat to get these really nice orbs from original rock without the use of a tumbler. These are just some more of the marbles that Tom had made from the different types of rocks that he encountered as a field geologist. These in particular are pieces of obsidian, including snowflake obsidian from Wyoming. Tom also had a really stellar memory. When in high school, he recalled driving to Bakersfield with his father to buy a bull to add to the ranch herd. On that trip, he was driving through the Tehachapi Mountains and started recognizing some of the rock sequences that he had seen on Rancho San Julian. This stuck with him. As you can see, years and years later, he would go back and collect rocks from the Tehachapi and then start making marbles using the Bakersfield High School lapidary. Tom was also very adept at crossing rough terrain, which is kind of funny considering he didn't consider himself that much of a rugged wanderer when he was younger. He actually said, quote, my dad had urged me to go out with a geologist each day, a geologist who was visiting the ranch, even though I was somewhat reluctant because I was not used to walking. But I really got to love walking all over Rancho San Julian, and I was excited when Mr. Johnson showed me geologic formations and structures wherever we went. That geologist, Harry Johnson, came out to Rancho San Julian in 1925, and he had done so at the request of Tom's father. And Tom had mentioned at the time just how intriguing he found it all to be. He said, quote, of Harry Johnson's map, I gazed at it for hours. When he finished his work and left, he left his geologic map with Dad and me for a year. During that time, I field checked his map, walked all over the ranch with the aerial photographs with geology for each area, and later comparing them with what is shown on Mr. Johnson's geologic map. The result of that was Tom making his own map as a teenager. And this is the original map that Tom had made. So this was by hand that he had sketched out, including, as you can see at the top there, some of these cross sections for interpreting or inferring subsurface structure. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this was 110 square miles that Tom had mapped out, and it was prior to receiving any formal geologic training, just the little bits and pieces that he had learned from Harry Johnson. This map was completed in 1932 before he went off to college, and Tom said, "This was my first geologic map, the first of this area, unknown to geologists, and the first ever prepared by a high school student. Dad and Mom were real proud of me for this effort." So this began 75 years of geologic mapping for Tom Dibblee. Before we go much further, I want to just cover quickly what exactly geologic mapping is. If we were to try and sum it up, we could say that it's the collection of data to produce interpretations, such as maps, stratigraphic columns, and cross-sections that illustrate exposed geology in areas, specifically faults and the distribution, compositions, and ages of rock layers and sediments. The angle of the rock layers, or dip, can be used to infer the subsurface structures, such as folds. Observed features of the rock layers, such as sedimentary structures, color, and mineral composition, are used to classify geologic units and interpret their origins. This is a bird's eye view of a geologic map. And going off what we were just talking about with the dip, you can then draw these cross sections as below. These have a number of uses. These types of maps have a number of uses, including land use planning, energy and mineral resources, hydrology and groundwater resources, and geohazard preparation and mitigation for things such as earthquakes. In 1932, Tom went off to Stanford, and he really fell in love with the access he had to all the US Geological Survey maps at the time. He just dove into the reports and ate up everything he could get. One of his fellow students, Ben Page, said, "Tom revealed in the geology and established his legendary reputation for roaming harsh country with the greatest of ease on his own 2 feet. Moreover, he understood most of what he saw." After college, Tom briefly worked for an oil company called Union, and then he went to work for Richfield Oil for 15 years. Tom mapped all the potential oil-producing basins in California, Oregon, and Washington, and this included the Russell Ranch and South Cuyama oil fields. Tom did the mapping in that area in 1948. Based on his recommendations, Richfield struck oil in 1949. The 2 oil fields produced a combined 300 million barrels and were exactly what Richfield needed to prevent them from going under in the early years. This last picture here shows Tom standing in front of the Dibblee Sands, which are the fractured parts of the Vaqueros Formation that ended up being this oil reservoir that produced so much oil. It was during his time at Richfield that Tom met Loretta Escobosa. She was the secretary of the exploration department at Richfield. They married in 1949. And even when Tom was in the field working by himself, he was frequently thinking of Loretta and coming up with creative ways to keep her with him. This included making cards when they were back in Santa Barbara, such as this card from 1991 for her 82nd birthday. It's just another example of Tom's creativity and just a really sweet memento that he had for Loretta. In 1952, he started working at the US Geological Survey, and I'll let John continue with that story.
Thank you, John. Tom left Richfield in 1952, as John said, and joined the United States Geological Survey, the USGS. And he would stay there for 25 years. The USGS was a dream job for Tom. While at Stanford, Tom would spend hours going through the large USGS folios, or the Geologic Map Index atlases, and he knew he always wanted to map the geology of California for the USGS. His first major project was mapping the Mojave Desert, to inventory for boron deposits for possible use as jet and rocket fuel. For the project, in all, he mapped an area of about 7,000 square miles. Typically, geologists depict the surface geologic conditions on a topographic map, as you can see in the background there on the screen. When Tom started mapping the Mojave project, topo was not available. And so he had to map on enlarged aerial photographs, as he did much in later life also. But after the topo became available, he would transfer that geology. In all, he produced 40 15-minute quadrangles of his mapping. Tom's first map of the Mojave was published as an open file report in 1957. Why did they need boron? Well, beginning the night in the early 1950s, the Navy and others started experimenting with ZIP fuels, ZIP fuels, or high energy fuels, HEF, that contain hydroboron compounds. The boron was a high energy and low weight compound that extended the range of the jet aircraft. As it turned out, the boron added about 40% more efficiency to the fuel, but it was toxic when it burned. And it also had an abrasive nature when burned. And so the Navy terminated the project in 1959, just 2 years after Tom finished his map. Tom's final report was published in 1967, but of course, it wasn't just about boron, it was about the geology of the Mojave Desert. And so it's still today, it's a tremendous value to anybody who's looking for groundwater or looking at other mineral opportunities and a lot of other things. So it was a good project. For the Mojave work, Tom received the Department of Interior's Distinguished Service Award, which was it's a nice medal to have. Thank you.
Tom's next project was to map the San Andreas Fault zone. The map we're looking at here just has a crude tracing of the track that Tom mapped. And this included a 50-mile wide swath, so 25 miles on each side of the fault zone. And it ranged from Coachella Valley up to the San Francisco Bay. And this amounted to roughly 40 individual 15-minute quadrangles. It also resulted in the 1953 co-authored paper with Mason Hill that you can see pictured here. This paper was very significant for a number of reasons. First and foremost, that it had proposed for the first time over 300 miles of lateral displacement of rocks along the San Andreas Fault. To put this into context, you have to realize that this was prior to the formal proposal of plate tectonics theory in 1965. And the Hill and Dibblee paper from 1953 ended up becoming one of the fundamental papers for the creation of the theory of plate tectonics. Real quick, I just want to take a quick explanation on what plate tectonics, the theory of plate tectonics is, and show that we actually have a couple connections to this really important concept in geology. Plate tectonics describes the large-scale motion of chunks of Earth's crust that we call plates. And these can be either marine plates, oceanic plates, devised of a certain type of rock composition, or continental crust. And the interactions between these plates depends on the composition of the rocks and their density. So for example, you can have a divergent boundary in oceanic plates where rocks are being pushed apart from volcanic eruptions at mid-ocean spreading ridges. You can also have convergent boundaries where plates are colliding. Two continental plates will give you mountain building. A marine plate colliding with a continental plate will subduct or go underneath that continental plate, leading to volcanism as well as earthquakes. And finally, there's the transform boundary where two plates slide past each other, like what we see at the San Andreas Fault zone. Retired professor Dr. Tanya Atwater from UC Santa Barbara was a critical player in developing plate tectonic theory, and her work with paleomagnetism helped reconstruct Santa Barbara's unique geology. You might have seen a video like this, where you can see the dark reddish brown area is actually the Santa Barbara region. It had been part of the North American plate, and then starting about 18 million years ago was sheared off and essentially hitched a ride with the Pacific plate moving to the northwest. Over those millions of years, that chunk of land was rotated, and then about 5 million years ago, it had been compressed as it was pushed up back against the North American plate. And that compression led to the uplift of both the transverse mountain ranges as well as the Channel Islands. This explains our very unique ecology and geology, being the one part of the extensive east-west trending part of the California coastline. And this really puts into context the structural features that Tom had recognized early on. Tom would later say of the Hill and Dibblee paper that, quote, "it created quite some turmoil in the geologic community. It also shows that while a practical economic reason to map geology is to find oil, geologic mapping is also the basis of this most exciting science. That is, geology begins with mapping." And Tom's geologic mapping ended up being fundamental to our modern understanding of geology and plate tectonics.
Tom in the field. You know, most successful field geologists complete just a few quadrangles of geologic mapping in their lifetime. And a very successful field geologist, perhaps, 12 to 15 quadrangles. Well, in Tom's mapping, over 75 years, he mapped 550 quadrangles of California geology. As John alluded to, it was a quarter of the state of California. While at Richfield, Tom mapped all the potential oil-bearing basins and areas in California, as John had said. While he was hired to do that, map those areas, he mapped extensive areas in between those basins while off the clock on his evenings and weekends and holidays. He generally began his mapping of an area with all he could determine from the aerial photographs, and he would transfer those onto the topo. Once in the field, he walked the ridge lines to get best advantage points, and then retreated to the canyon bottoms to field check those ridgeline observations. Tom learned to accurately estimate the amount of dip and direction of strike of bedded rocks from the ridgelines, so he didn't have to go to the bottom and use a button compass like most geologists do. He mapped only exposed and clear evidence of faults and used little speculation. He carried only his field sheets and pencils and made a few notes in the margin of his field sheets. Primarily, he just relied on the composite stratigraphic column on the side of the sheet that you would see today on his printed versions. Tom had a phenomenal memory, so he did not need to take a lot of notes. He knew the characteristics of the rocks that he walked over. He remembered those rock sequences. And consistency was one of the hallmarks of any Dibblee map. And by mapping the stratigraphic units as consistent and thoroughly as possible, he was able to recognize the sequences of rocks from other areas and just look for local variations and structural deformation. And this way he could move very quickly over the land and do a good job. When mapping in remote areas, Tom would sleep in the front seat of his car. He was a tall man, so he had a board extending out for his legs and his feet, and he sawed off the lower portion of his steering wheel to make it more roomy. He said it was a waste of time to drive to a motel in the evening. One of my favorite memories of Tom that happened over and over again was when at professional society meetings or at field trips, often a student would come up to him and start a conversation about some particular area they had visited and were looking for a geologic interpretation from Tom. Invariably, Tom would immediately know the area of question and have a lengthy discussion about the conditions of that site, even though Tom probably hadn't been there for 30 or 40 years. So his memory was was a key to his ability to be able to do so much mapping in so little time and do it so consistently.
One other aspect of Tom's fieldwork that we should mention are his famous Loretta Stones. So when Tom was out in the field, he was mostly alone. He didn't map with partners very much, but that wasn't to say that he necessarily wanted to not think of anyone else. In fact, he was constantly thinking of his wife Loretta and made the Loretta Stones, which, contrary to the name, weren't actually made of rocks. Usually they were things like small gourds. And so we have a number of these here at the museum as we hold or have archived a number of Tom's effects, including these pretty little Loretta Stones. And then one aspect that's always worth pointing out is that Loretta always or almost always wore a barrette in her hair. And Tom was always sure to make sure to include that detail on the Loretta Stones. So these little effigies were his way of keeping Loretta with him when he was out in the field. After Tom left the USGS in 1977, he immediately went to work as a geologic mapper as volunteering. And he volunteered for 6 years to map the 1.2 million acres of Los Padres National Forest. This resulted in 106 individual 7.5-minute quadrangles. This is an example of one of those maps. And you can see what we talked a little bit about earlier with the cross sections. This is the transect for the cross section that he created. And that's here at the top of this slide, where he has inferred and interpreted the subsurface structure of part of Los Padres. For his efforts in 1983, Tom was awarded the Presidential Volunteer Action Award from President Reagan.
In 1986, I visited Tom in his home office to borrow 3 unpublished maps for my use as a consultant. Tom was ready for me when I arrived, and he had gone downtown and had blueprint copies made of the maps and gave them to me. At that point, most of Tom's mapping was generally unavailable to the public. While I was there, Tom introduced me to the foundation that had been established in his name. And before I left that day, I volunteered to help the foundation. The mission of the Thomas Wilson Dibbley Jr. Geological Foundation was to help preserve the scientific, technical, educational, and economic value of Dibley's life work through the timely publication in full color with consistent nomenclature and color schemes. While there in Tom's office, he showed me a stack of perhaps 100 maps that were ready to be published that most people could not acquire. Maps published by others, including Tom's USGS maps, were published using inconsistent scales and color schemes, making it very difficult to identify similar units from map to map. When you put 2 maps together, side by side, where they met, you couldn't go from one to the other without rethinking what was going on because they were inconsistent. The foundation hired geologist Helmut Ehrenspec as editor and mapping partner with Tom. Helmut's previous employer was the U.S. Forest Service, where he worked as editor for Tom's mapping in the Los Padres Forest. So he already was familiar with Tom's work. Tom asked Helmut to develop a fast and economical way to print maps in full color. The existing methods were at that time very time-consuming and very expensive. Helmut adapted cell painting technology commonly used in the Sunday comics. With the Sunday comics, they were able to publish in a few days. So each map from field sheet to about 1,000 copies cost $10,000, and Helmut was able to produce 6 to 8 maps per year. Helmut completed 71 maps before his untimely passing in 2001. For those years, Helmut was not only the editor, but he also was Tom's field partner. So he would spend, every time Tom went in the field, Helmut was by his side. And through a lot of the geologic conditions, Helmut was very resourceful and knew more about the rocks than Tom did in a lot of areas. On a volunteer trip to the High Sierra camp for disadvantaged youth is when Helmut passed away. Helmut's last map was produced in digital format. Geologist John Minch took over and started producing digital maps using Adobe Illustrator that were much cheaper and faster than Helmut's original method. Overall, John was able to publish over 100 maps a year. John Minch, with the museum and the foundation, finished the publication of Tom's maps, including digitizing Helmut's maps. Those 419 maps are currently sold for about $20 each at the Museum of Natural History in Santa Barbara. To acknowledge the significance of Tom's life work, and the Dibblee Medal was awarded annually to a field geologist who made outstanding contributions to the science of geology by quantity and quality of their published geologic maps for the benefit of others. The Dibblee Medal was a sterling silver medallion with the likeness of Tom Dibblee on one side and a sketch map of California on the other, the geology of which was the domain of Tom Dibblee for more than 75 years. The Dibblee Medal was awarded to 12 outstanding geologists. In 1988, I wrote a letter to then President Ronald Reagan asking for Dibblee map funding. President Reagan, as you know, owned Rancho Cielo in Refugio Canyon, and the foundation publication was moving west in that direction. The Dibblee Foundation was a pure grassroots funded organization that never received government funding, and I let President Reagan know this. President Reagan sent a personal check to him out of $500 for future publication. The letter from his counsel said that the president was very interested in the efforts of the foundation and the publication of the San Andreas Quadrangle. After the publication of that quadrangle, I sent copies of that map to President Reagan. Tom's maps are used daily by geologists in all aspects of industry, energy exploration, environmental consulting, construction, and insurance industry, and as well as the conservation, education, and research. Dibblee, as I alluded to earlier, the Dibblee Foundation published 419 maps that of 550 quadrangles of Tom's works. Many of those maps were double quadrangles on one map.
In 2002, the Dibblee Foundation joined forces with the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. This was important for a number of reasons. One was that Tom had frequently lamented the fact that his hometown Natural History Museum did not have a geology program. He saw geology as essential to natural history and science, which it is. Tom had bequeathed his estate, including his home and numerous personal effects, to the SBMNH to serve as the foundation to the Dibblee Endowment for Earth Science. The day that this was announced, Tom called it the greatest day of his life, to have his hometown museum establish a geology program in his name. The goal of the Dibblee Endowment is to continue to share Tom's work through map sales and to honor Tom's work by revamping the Earth Science program at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. Tom had earned a number of accolades throughout his career, and deservedly so. Amongst this list, or not listed here, is a 1987 dinner that was held in Tom's honor in Santa Barbara. At this dinner, he was presented with a letter from President Reagan and plaques from the United States Congress, the California State Legislature, the City and County of Santa Barbara, and the City and County of Ventura, Stanford University, and UC Santa Barbara. Tom was highly revered by geologists, especially in California, and he'd regularly attend the Coast Geological Society meetings at Ventura. He was often holding court at the beer keg, and as John was saying earlier, he would amaze students and professionals alike with his uncanny ability to identify a locality based on just the description. The Dibblee Foundation also ran field trips with Tom, And imagine 150 geologists hanging out with Tom Dibblee in the field for 8 hours. And a large part of that time was spent with Tom seated, just answering questions and citing things. He really was a rock star. Tom was productive past his 93rd birthday. In November 2004, he lost his eyesight literally overnight, which prevented him from working on more maps. He passed away 10 days later on November 17, 2004. The SBMNH honors Tom's legacy in a variety of ways. As John had mentioned, over 400 maps are available through the SBMNH Museum store. And you can also get these now from the online store. Digital versions of the maps are currently available through the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. One of the goals for the endowment was to get the Earth Science program revamped at Santa Barbara Museum, and that required hiring a geologist. In 2017, I was fortunate to start as the Dibblee Collection Manager of Earth Science here at the museum, and at the beginning of 2020, that was a promotion to Dibblee Curator of Earth Science. And I was very fortunate early on to have an opportunity to do field work on Santa Rosa Island. And this was a really wonderful thing that I think intersects with a lot of Tom's passions. For starters, this sea cow that we had excavated was found by a pair of geologists working for the United States Geological Survey. They were out on the island updating Tom's older maps. And what's kind of neat is this particular area they were looking at has a number of faults running through there. And this fossil, we're hoping, will help provide them ages for these faults to recreate or reconstruct that timeline of structural geology. This was also an opportunity to do field work on federal lands, something that was near and dear to Tom's heart. And it was a collaboration amongst a number of local institutions that he cared about, including UC Santa Barbara, Santa Barbara City College, Channel Islands National Park, and of course the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. There are a number of things that are currently underway, including the building and designing of a new dedicated fossil preparation laboratory, and building an earth science collection that contains both rocks and fossils that are representative of the Central Coast. Also, we're in the design stages of a new earth science collection range with state-of-the-art cabinetry to best preserve paleontological and geologic materials. The picture here you see is the recently renovated vertebrate zoology collection range. And you can see from the picture, they're just amazing cabinets that provide everything we need to properly archive and maintain these collections. So what lies ahead? Well, we have a number of initiatives we're working on, including making the rest of the maps digitized and available, and looking at things like georeferencing maps so that a geologist can take a tablet out into the field, and provided they have GPS, they'll actually be able to locate themselves on the digital map using the tablet. We're also interested in promoting the teaching of geologic mapping at regional universities and colleges where there's still a heavy need, and looking at ways to publish Tom's autobiography that he wrote before he died. And finally, we're interested in growing the Earth Science program with additional staff. At this point, the Dibblee Endowment is not fully funded, but if you're interested in contributing, you can contact our Director of Development, Caroline Baker. Her contact information is there. Other ways that you can support are by purchasing maps through the SBMNH store, and also volunteering when we're able to have volunteers again, as volunteers are the backbone to the Earth Science program here. Helping out with everything from cataloging the gems and minerals in the collections to preparing the fossils that are recovered. And with that, we'll take any questions you have and leave you with a little bit of map imagery here.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and John. So interesting. I know for myself, I've always heard of the Dibblee maps, but I didn't really know much about the man behind the map, so to speak. So really interesting information. So we do have a few questions for you all. One is that you mentioned that there are many more maps that you hope to make available. How many maps are there still to be published?
Roughly, it's over 100. It's, I believe, roughly about 130, if that sounds right, John.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Actually, I don't recall.
Somebody
Yeah.
wanted to know, John, how you first met Tom Dibblee.
I was working on a project in Ventura, and one of my partners said, well, I was looking for a geologic map of the area. And one of my partners said, well, you should go see Tom Dibblee. And I remember Tom's name. I didn't know a whole lot about Tom Dibblee, but one of my first projects in undergraduate school was reviewing the Hill and Dibley paper on the San Andreas Fault. And I thought it was kind of ironic in the long run. But anyway, so I called Tom on the phone, and he invited me up to his home office. And it was a large office over a big garage. And he, like I said earlier, he had the maps. He went downtown and made blue lines of his pencil drawn maps, and it gave them to me. And so we had a couple hours of conversation about the geology of the area that I was looking at, but also about the foundation that had just been established in his name. So it became a wonderful experience in the long run, because I was able to spend a lot of time with Tom, both on a personal level, but also on the professional level, dealing with the foundation and with Helmet, and with a whole bunch of other people that helped Tom and Helmet along the way, and a lot of great people.
Great opportunity and experiences, I'm sure.
Yes.
Someone wanted to know how Tom made those handmade marbles.
Well, I was with Tom, and we were going to a Pacific section meeting in Bakersfield, and we discussed earlier that there were professional society meetings, and there were a bunch of geologists get together from all different aspects of the industry of geology and related industries, and they meet, and they have dinner, and they present talks, and you learn something, but you also get to socialize with all your colleagues. And Tom and I were on the way, and I don't remember the street, but we drove past Bakersfield High School. And he said, I used to go there every evening and use their grinders in the shop, and I would hand grind my rocks to make them almost perfectly round. And then he developed a little metal device that would hold the round, almost round marble or rock, and that it would let it spin, but it would work on just the high points of the rock. So therefore he could make it round, and then he would hand polish those. He didn't use a tumbler, as far as I know, ever. It was all done just with the grinder and with buffing wheels and things like that.
Awesome. Let's see, our own John Johnson wanted to know what percentage of California was covered by Tom's mapping.
Roughly 1/4. Which, when you think about what it requires to get out and do that field work, just think of traversing that transect for the San Andreas Fault zone. That's a lot of time out in the field. And as John Powell had said earlier, that for a productive geologic mapper, you're talking dozens of maps produced in their career. With Tom Dibblee, we talk about hundreds. So it is a gobstopping amount of land that he covered, and the work that he produced will probably never really be matched.
If you think about it, he mapped from the Mexican border up to just north of San Francisco, and then from the coastline over to the edge of the Great Valley, because the Great Valley sequence was, very benign geology, just little materials. So all the rocks that were exposed in that whole area, he mapped, and like John said, he had to walk the ridge lines and field check all the areas. Just tremendous accomplishment. Yes,
absolutely. Priscilla asked, are you considering a public display of some Dibblee maps, some marbles, and Loretta Stones?
Yeah, so we've had a couple little temporary displays up. I think most recently we had some of the Dibblee maps up in our courtyard area in one of the outside display cases there. We've talked about a couple different ideas for featuring some of Tom's work. Probably the biggest thing right now is, of course, having the maps available through the museum store. But we've been talking about a couple ways we can kind of better exhibit Tom's work.
Where do the Loretta Stones live right now, John?
They're in our museum library, and our librarian and historian, Terry Sheridan, takes care of those. And it's really a pretty cool place to visit. I was spending some time there recently gathering photos, and you get to see a presidential service medal sitting next to an original map that Tom had made, and then of course his Loretta Stones and his marbles. Seeing the personal effects is a really cool thing. And I know Terry and myself, we've both given folks tours of those collections because there are a lot of Dibblee fans out there. Unfortunately, I never met Tom, but I got to tell you, having my title be the Dibblee Chair starts so many conversations every time I go to a geology conference. And my first time at the Coast Geological Society, I was approached by so many people who were anxious to tell their stories about Tom. And it's one of the best parts about being the Dibblee Chair is meeting all these different folks who knew Tom and have their stories. And for folks interested, you can always reach out to me. My email address is up there. And when we're allowed to have visitors again and give tours, I'd be happy to give anyone interested in a tour of Tom's effects.
I was just going to say, as soon as we can be back at the museum, we'll definitely have to set up a behind the scenes with leadership circles.
Yeah,
It'll be a great visit. It was asked if Tom and Loretta had any children.
They did not.
Okay. So to expand on the Dibblee stone, Loretta Stones a little bit, the ones that John depicted there were gourds. They're, I don't know the name of the gourd, but they're about as big around as a baseball. But he also he had rocks, and he had round rocks, and he painted on round rocks. And I'm fortunate to have the gourd Loretta Stones, but I don't have a real rock Loretta Stone. I'd love to have one, but I know that his relatives have a lot of those, and I don't know if those are in the museum archives too. But they're rocks that he painted to look like Loretta, but they were a little bit more to carry around, harder to carry around than of course the gourds, the dry gourds were. So anyway.
John, it was asked if you were inspired by or related to John Wesley Powell.
Well, I tried to name my boys Wesley, but that didn't work. Of course, I learned about John Wesley Powell in college and in school, and I've read a lot about John Wesley Powell, and I think yes, I've been inspired by him. Who wouldn't be after reading what he accomplished in his life, and we talk about topography sheets. I think he began the program in the USGS to map the United States, and that didn't occur till completely until just a few years ago. But he started that program, and to have topo sheets, for every bit of the United States and its provinces. And so, yes, I was tremendously inspired by John Wesley Powell.
Awesome. Just time for maybe a couple more questions. Do either of you, or have either of you done geologic maps yourselves?
I used, as I said earlier, I used Tom's map. Tom, no, as far as being a field geologist and mapping like Tom, no, I did not. I was a consulting engineering geologist, and I worked on project sites that were acres in size or something like that. And so I would take Tom's geology, and I would use that as the basis to begin my project. But then I would spend a lot more time in the area of acres of size, and then refine that geology way past what Tom would have looked for and the detailed mapping that he would have used, when he was doing his work. And that was the real benefit to me, was I could look at it, and before I even went in the field, I knew exactly what I was going to find when I got there, and I just provided more detail for that.
Gotcha. It was asked, how did Tom and Helmut choose the colors for his maps?
We spent a lot of time on the color schemes, and that extended past Helmut's life too, into John Minch's life, because, and Susie Bart, who I believe is listening, would know a lot more about this, I think, because she spent so much time working with John Minch. There's common in geologic mapping and geologic mapping literature, there are common colors. And so basically they had to go through all of that and decide what was appropriate in Tom's mind and Helmut's mind to be able to establish, a granite has a certain color and a sandstone has a certain color, and to go from there. But then when you travel from area to area, there's so many different variations, it becomes very difficult to not have way too many colors. So it was important to establish that firmly in the beginning, and then just try to stick with that throughout the mapping area, because the mapping area was so large. According to the state of California, just a huge area. So, but mostly on convention. There was convention for colors in geologic maps.
Billy wanted to know, what were Tom's earliest thoughts of plate tectonics?
I'm
John?
not sure on that. Yeah, I haven't. I'm going through his autobiography. I don't recall if he was sharing his early thoughts. Yeah, I'm not really sure.
I think basically he was just in his paper. He was just saying, "This is what we found. This is what I saw." He would identify a series of rocks along one side of the fault, and then 300 miles away, he would identify the same series of rocks on the other side of the fault, and juxtapose immediately across the fault from each of those was something completely different. So it's because of his memory. And once again, those mapping in those areas that are 300 miles or 400 miles apart was done years at different years. And he was able to remember those sequences and say, wait a minute. So I don't know that I ever had a discussion about plate tectonics with Tom. I remember him when we were out of Santa Cruz Island one time with Tanya Hotwater, and him chuckling at one of her videos, because they're kind of comical, but they really show what was going on. But I don't think I ever have a conversation about his thoughts on that.
Thank you. Marjorie asked, did Tom or anyone else make an estimate of how many total miles he walked in his decades of mapping our geology in Southern and Central California?
No, I don't think so.
Would be an interesting figure to come up with, I suppose.
It would.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
let's see.
you think about walking to the top of the hill in your backyard, and then multiplying that, yes, it's an amazing amount of area.
So just a couple more, and then we're going to run out of time here, but I'm going to combine a couple. Susan asked, are there maps available of the Channel Islands that Tom created? And then also we were asked if someone wanted to get a map of a specific area, how they would go about doing that if they came to, or when they can come to the museum.
So yes, there are Dibblee maps of the Channel Islands, and those maps, as well as any map of a particular area someone is interested in, you can get either through the museum website. So if you want to get one right away, you can order that through there, and the physical maps will be shipped to you. Otherwise, you can come into the museum store, and I believe, if I remember correctly, I'm going to probably butcher this. The email address you'll want to contact is info@sbnature2.org, and they'll be able to help you out with purchasing maps.
Yeah, on the website, there's a tremendous index, and it's broken up into smaller geographic areas, and it's pretty easy to identify your particular area, especially if you're familiar with the topographic sheet that you're looking for. And so a good way to do that is to go to your map store downtown, the travel store, and get a topo sheet, and you can find where you're located, and then go from there to the geologic map.
Great, thank you. And last one for the evening. Can John explain why lettuce was included in the cartoon illustration?
What's
It's a
John?
good story.
So, and I don't remember his supervisor's name, but it was one of his early jobs. At, I believe I don't know if it was Unicao or Richfield, or Union or Richfield. Tom turned in an insane expense report for 2 weeks at a time of about 43 cents, something like that. Tom, as we talked about, Tom slept in the field in his car, so he didn't have a motel expense. Tom didn't eat a whole lot, but his boss came out to see him one time and said, how do you survive on 43 cents or just a couple dollars for your expense report? And well, he learned that Tom said, well, I was driving to out here, and I found a case of lettuce on the side of the road. I saw it, and I stopped, and I picked it up, and I ate that for days on end. So and it was it's been that cartoon was drawn by Harold Sully, and a geologist that lived in Carpinteria, and a great Dibblee director, just a great guy, all around great guy, and good geologist. And so anyway, he was a very talented artist also. That's I don't remember the whole story and who was involved in it, but that was the gist of it.
The gist of it. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. Well, I want to give a sincere thank you to Jonathan and John for this evening's presentation. So interesting, and we so appreciate your time, your expertise, your great stories. It really is such a wonderful opportunity to really kind of delve into somebody's life that's been so influential for our museum. I also wanted to give a shout out and thanks to Development Officer Melissa Baffa, who has helped us behind the scenes with this webinar. If you have any additional questions, would like to follow up with Jonathan or John, their information is on the screen, and they both said feel free to reach out to them via email, and they'll help you out. And I also want to remind everybody to mark on their calendars that our next Legends of the Halls is coming up next month, February 25th, 5:30 to 6:30. It's called Washed Ashore, the museum's blue whale skeleton. it's going to be really interesting. Some of you may know some of the history of the skeleton or skeletons, but it's going to cover its finding on the beach at Vandenberg Air Force Base to today, and how iconic it is for our museum, how important it is for education. There's just a lot of wonderful stories associated with the skeleton, so we hope you'll join us then. And lastly, thanks to all of you for being with us tonight, for being members of the museum, supporting us in that way. We're so happy to have you with us, and we really appreciate you being part of our museum family. So until next time, enjoy this lovely rain. Everybody stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.